speak a little and then maybe play at the end, because you can always trust me to thin out an audience. So, this is the only symposium where I've ever had the chance to experiment with cocktails and with sausages, so it's fantastic. Explicitly I was going to talk about turntablism because that was originally Annetta's kind of opening gambit to me to come and talk about turntables, and of course turntablism is inherently linked with John Cage, one of our most important links to the Black Mountain experiment, or you might say tradition. But perhaps it's helpful for me to say a little bit about myself and how this relates to artistic research in the institution that I work in, and also in the other networks that I work in. I should say that I work in Canterbury Christchurch University, which was set up in the 1960s as a teaching college. It had no aspirations to be a research institution at all. But most recently, research has come onto the agenda, particularly through the arts and humanities faculties. And I'm both the kind of positive and the negative, the yin and the yang in the situation, in that I was also an output assessor in the REF 2014 exercise. I was one of the 5 composers chosen to look at around 700 works from around the UK, and specifically to push the debate about what is artistic research in relationship to music. And for me, of course, it's fantastic to be here talking to art theorists. It's also, of course, quite daunting because I am a musician and my tradition, it comes from a slightly different place. My education was in the 3 institutions that you can study in Europe really for music. So the university system, the conservatoire system, and the so-called music college, which in some aspects, the music college, certainly in the UK, in some institutions that retains the spirit of Black Mountain College. So the music college that I studied in was Goldsmiths College, which, as we know, it has a long history in the visual arts, but in music, perhaps it's slightly less codified, arguably. If there are any colleagues from Goldsmiths, we can talk about that. But the interesting thing for me is the way in which all of these institutions have framed what I would call a kind of a dialectical approach to thinking about what is artistic research, because artistic research in each of those 3 kinds of institutions, in musical terms, means very different things. So music colleges are traditionally the domain of the orchestral composer, and they write scores. And in the UK, one of the most helpful things for composers to be accepted as artistic researchers was because they produced scores, because they produced more text, effectively. So some might say not practice at all, just creating a template for practice. So we were talking about the arts administrators. Of course, composers that produce lots of scores are incredibly helpful for arts administrators because it's a quantifiable thing. I have spent my research time creating this document, and it's a document printed on the same paper that all of these articles are printed on. So in a way, the composers were, certainly in music, in the UK, the composers were the first bastion of kind of practice-based research because they produced these scores. Now, working with turntables, of course, you have some interesting questions about whether or not you make a score or not. What is the document for your research? Well, actually, you start with scores. You start with these things. But the score isn't mine, it's somebody else's. So this first point about collaboration, about the Black Mountain experiment, every time I play, this evening was a collaboration with all of these artists, most of them dead, encased on this vinyl. So for me, the starting point is a score, but it's not one that I created. And you might say it's a graphic score, in a sense. It's open form. I actually rearranged the records here on the table before I started. I know what these sound like, but I'm most interested in the moments where I don't know what's going to happen with these records. So for me, these are texts. In fact, they're such well-worn texts that they break through international travel and so on. But like a well-worn text, I hope that they come together and they make interesting dialectical tensions between them. They're also circular, and you might say that that's a metaphor for the academic debate, but that's another story. What I'm interested in is the way in which John Cage brought the notion of this instrument here, the turntable, into that world of scoring, and how it started to generate ideas about compositional thinking. What I've sort of suggested is a few sort of slides that actually I might show whilst I carry on performing, which are essentially the ideas that John Cage brought into the idea of musical scoring. The first one being that Cage he formally declared a compositional interest in the vari-speed turntable with his Imaginary Landscape No. 1 from 1939. And whilst he was not the first and certainly not the last artist to work with record players, he was technically the first to conceive of this device within a musical score, and therefore to consider how the manipulation of records could be musically notated. So what we have is, in the Imaginary Landscape of 1939, is we have a very, very simple musical scoring of just the notes that you would hear, notated almost as if it could be performed on a cello, for instance. There's nothing particularly groundbreaking about the notation that he uses, but the interesting thing is the whole chain of events that started to set off. So, like most researchers, I have to start from when I was born and from my present and work backwards. In artistic research in new musical forms, we're always thinking about the non-linearity of the narrative of the field that we're working in. So we look back to John Cage because it's a convenient starting point. He's the first one to score this. So again, I'm perhaps being very conservative in that I look to a score as being an identifier, a blueprint for music. But by the same token, we have a very long lineage that comes from that. Of course, the hip-hop tradition, but also visual artists that were working with turntables at the same time, such as Christian Marclay, who would make his own records through splicing lots of different records together. And then Otomo Yoshida, who's a noise artist in Japan. It's interesting that we all know what happened to Christian Marclay, although he still plays turntables at Café Otto in London very many times, his new native country. And interestingly, Otomo Yoshida, who has a history as a punk turntablist, has now become a celebrity on Japanese TV because he has his own soap opera. So there's an interesting kind of situation that we're seeing here with the interest that students have in wanting to think about turntablism as a form of experimental music making that has many different lineages. In fact, they are currently writing the lineage of turntable history. There are really two authors that have really tried to get to grips with this. One is actually a German, Ulf Pustkart, who wrote DJ Culture in 1992. A very successful critique, really, of DJ culture, looking at the ways in which the turntables can be considered as a kind of art of deconstructing and reconstructing texts, as records as texts. And the other author is an American from University of North Carolina, Mark Katz, who's recently written a book which looks specifically at the hip-hop tradition, but ways in which the hip-hop tradition may link back to people like John Cage. It's a dialogue, a history, of course, that's being written by historians. But I would be quite interested in the notion that the techniques that John Cage developed could appear in hip-hop music and vice versa. And actually, we hear that. If we can listen to the early works of John Cage, we can actually hear very early hip-hop techniques, jump cutting and scratching and so on. So some of the techniques I was using there are relatively new, such as a technique called the half contact, where you take the the needle, and you only place it at a half point, so it has a natural looping mechanism. And actually in this room, because it's very hot, the record actually warps. So I was only playing the warm parts of the record. So there's real indeterminacy here. I know the score, I know the part of the score, but I also have to respect the conditions and let the conditions let this work. So for me, this is like artistic research, especially with the kinds of students that I have. We were talking about searching earlier. I have a student that is just completing a 4-year artistic research PhD at our institution, where we luckily have a very, very open policy. And I think that is because research was not on the agenda for so long. We've actually sneaked slightly under the radar and are able to suggest artistic PhD programs where, for instance, the final dissertation is an entirely improvised performance in a venue of the student's choice, with some written content and with critique across the whole process from world-leading artists in that particular field. But the function of the artistic PhD, certainly in our institution, is to enable the artist to make more art in a critically self-reflective way, but that crucially that art should be documented in art. So it's one of the categories that James was talking about earlier. We are very much interested in generating text, but there are many of us as supervisors that are really trying to push ourselves on this notion that artistic research can manifest itself in many other ways beyond text. So that's the point I'm trying to get at, I guess, in the work that I'm doing here. The notion of thinking about turntables as a kind of metaphor for artistic research is one that's interesting for me because of the notion of erosion, that the theory can't stay fixed for too long because the record itself wanes and it dies. And so we need to think about this in relationship to artistic research too, the notion of keeping the theoretical underpinning very, very sharp and very close to the moment. So I'm very much interested in the notion of, for instance, spontaneous dissertations, which I'm sure that would be quite a difficult notion, but this is the other part of what we're talking about, isn't it? At this symposium, this notion of experimentation. What I'm particularly interested in is the notion that by doing artistic research such as this with new media or relatively new media, what we're actually trying to do is articulate a new kind of discourse that could be applied to other art forms, but also potentially to science as well. So this notion that science pushes the research agenda, I think we're seeing in the UK, and I know because I was sitting on those ref panels pushing back against science, saying that the vitality and the diversity that James was talking about is something that we're absolutely crucial, we feel, in trying to push that. I don't know at this point if anybody has any questions about those ideas? No? Okay. What I thought I would do is, I know it's crucial for time. Do we have 5 minutes or so? Should I play a little more just to finish? Okay, thank you. It won't be long, I promise.